Hi, everyone, and welcome to this month's Denise Amberly Foundation Wednesday webinar. I'm very excited to have you guys here today to talk to you guys about empathy through texting. Following the webinar, we will be sending out the certificate and a link to the replay. We'll also be uploading our webinar to YouTube in case you guys want to check that out later. For those of you that are joining us for the first time, welcome. A little bit about our foundation. So the Denise Amber Lee Foundation was founded by Denise's husband, Nathan Lee, in June of 2008, 6 months after her tragic death. The foundation's mission is to help 911 centers across the country to avoid similar occurrences to someone else, and we work to support public safety through uniform training, standardized protocols, quality assurance, and technological advances to 911. The foundation offers on-site and online courses, third-party quality assurance services, as well as other opportunities throughout the year, including our Wednesday webinar. If you'd like any more information regarding the foundation, definitely email info@deniseamberlee.org. So for those of you that have been joining us for the previous webinars, you may have seen me pop on and introduce the guests, but I don't think I've taken the time to introduce myself. So my name is Diego Rodriguez. I'm an intern this year for the Denise Amber Lee Foundation. I'm currently the supervisor for the Southern Methodist University Police Department, the Communications Division in Dallas, and I also work part-time with the City of Garland. So one of the reasons that I'm here to talk to you about empathy through texting, and one of the reasons that I'm very passionate about this kind of goes back to when I first began my career in 911. So I started in 2010 with the city of Fort Worth. It was my first time working in a call center, first time working in what I call an adult job. I was working as a supervisor at McDonald's, and I saw that 911 was hiring, and I thought that looks like fun, and I decided to apply. When you work for a large agency or any agency really, and you've never had that experience of having to deal with traumatic calls, it's incredibly startling. So working for Fort Worth, a city of 960,000 people, I quickly had to learn about how to handle emergency situations. And one thing that I saw that was pretty common throughout our center was that a lot of people use dark humor, to deal with some of the traumatic events that we encounter in our day-to-day jobs. And, I kind of fell into it as well. It's kind of part of our culture. It's one of the more toxic traits of our culture, that we cope with these traumatic situations by kind of joking about them. Well, 3 years into working for 911, my best friend committed suicide, and I was profoundly affected by his death. And I remember, going to the funeral, coming back within a week, and taking a call for a woman that was going to jump off the overpass. And I remember, just having dealt with my friend's recent death, it was hard for me to process that call. But I ended up getting her help. The police got out there, they talked her off the ledge, and, she was safe. So as soon as I ended the call, I thought I need to get myself together. So I got up and I was just going to run to the restroom, just splash some water on my face, kind of refresh myself. And as I was walking out, my supervisor was like, who was near the door to go to the restroom, said, "I thought we were going to have a jumper. You ruined it for us." And I know that she meant that to be funny, but in that moment, it was really triggering for me, and it did affect me. And I thought, these are the people that are dealing with emergency calls. We need to do better. I need to do better. So it was at that point that I decided that, even though 911 was a very fulfilling career for me, I needed to do more, because I couldn't, unfortunately, screen all the calls for suicidal callers. I couldn't, screen the important calls and take them myself. I needed to do something else, something outside of 911. So that's when I decided that I was going to try to look for opportunities in crisis outreach or suicide hotlines. And I remember I interviewed with one agency to be a crisis counselor. And they said, "What is your main reason for wanting to do this?" I said, "Well, my friend just died." And they said, "No, stop." They said, "You need to take some time to heal. And why don't you come back later?" So it was about 3 years later in 2016 when I decided to join the National Crisis Text Line. So National Crisis Text Line before 988 was a text line that people could text in. if they were feeling like they were in crisis or they were feeling suicidal. And I absolutely loved it. The opportunity to be able to interact with people and kind of get them from a hot zone down to a cool place where they were able to explore other resources or reach out for help, to the local PSAPs, was something that I found incredibly fulfilling. So that's one of the things that I'm going to be talking about today, kind of using some of the tips and tricks that I learned through Crisis Text Line and how we can implement that in the comm center when we're dealing with caller or texters that are texting in. So let me just share my screen here. All right. And through the presentation, if you guys have any questions, comments, concerns, definitely feel free to just put them in the chat. So text to 911, most agencies have kind of moved over towards implementing that at their centers. It's part of the next gen 911, getting more technologically advanced in our centers. And I personally love text to 911 sometimes. When texters text in and they give you their address, the situation that's going on, and they tell you exactly what they want all in one message, that's ideal, that's perfect, that's great. But unfortunately, that doesn't happen all the time, right? Oftentimes you'll get messages that just say help. Oftentimes you'll get messages that just say, I'm thinking about killing myself. Or you'll get messages that say, I was raped by my uncle. What do I do? And in those situations, it's important that we practice empathy and that we reach out to our texter and let them know that we're there for them and kind of guide them through the process of getting more information from them that we need to process our calls, but also letting them know that even though it's via text, it's still something incredibly human. It's an incredibly human interaction and that we're there to help them. So some of the things that we'll be going over today, we'll be identifying the pros and cons of texting, learning how to build rapport through texting, identifying the texter's problems and goals, and troubleshooting issues with texters. So why is text such a powerful communication tool? So text has a 97% open rate. So when you receive a text, you read it, right? If you send a text to someone and they say they never got it, chances are they did get it, they just probably didn't respond. Calls can be dropped while text will still go through on smartphones with minimal service strength or Wi-Fi. And we've seen that in areas that are affected by major storms, hurricane areas. Sometimes those calls won't go through or the lines will be tied up. But if you have access to a smartphone, Wi-Fi, or you have minimal service strength, your text messages will still go out. Another thing about text is it's private, right? So you can text 911 from a bathroom stall at school or from your car parking lot. Nobody around you knows. And this is something incredibly important because a lot of the issues that get texted in sometimes are issues that are very intimate, issues that people don't want to share, issues that people don't want other people hearing them talk about. So it's an incredibly great tool for people that are trying to share stuff that's very important, very intimate, but that they don't want others to know about. And text is composed. So there are no ums, there are no likes, there's no hyperventilating, there's no hemming and hawing, there's no crying. It's all just facts. Text is asynchronous. So there are natural pauses in between the message, and it's normal to have a few minutes in between texts. These little gaps help people carefully construct and edit their words so that we can know exactly how to help them and exactly what's going on. And text previews allow you to screen and prioritize messages. So unlike 911 calls that come in, unless we answer the phone, we don't know what's going on the other end. It could be a difficulty breathing, it could be a stabbing, or it could be someone calling to complain about loud music. We just never know until we answer that phone. Certain softwares allow for text previews so that if you get a multitude of text messages, you can screen the text and then prioritize them based on severity, not chronologically as they're coming in. But then we also need to talk about the downside to texting. So on average, text to 911 commits dispatchers for about 18 minutes until they gather all the necessary information that they need to submit a call for service versus the national average of 4 minutes over the phone. And then the other issue is, how does a dispatcher relay their commitment to help a caller when we can't vocally console them? We can't tell them it's going to be okay, it's going to be fine, I'm here to help. and they can't sense that in our tone, how do we do that via text? And most 911 centers don't handle video or photo messages. So a lot of people will sometimes just share photos, share videos, and unfortunately they get those bounce back messages because we're not there yet. And again, the emergency texting is not available nationwide yet. So a lot of people, when they text 911, depending on their jurisdiction, they may get a bounce back message that says, please make a voice call to 911. There's no text to 911 service available at this time. So when we talk about building rapport and different techniques, I want you to think about someone that you've trusted immediately, right? What was it about that person? Were they kind? Were they genuine? And then I want you to think about someone who maybe you haven't trusted immediately. And what was it about that person? Were they standoffish or robotic? In emergency situations, it's important to remain professional and courteous, but not scripted or robotic. And I hear that all the time in the comm center sometimes when people maybe are trying to get the attention of the caller, they'll just say, ma'am, 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 or they'll repeat the same question over and over again. And repetitive persistence is a technique that can be used sometimes, but, oftentimes it just kind of sounds robotic and kind of, it's inefficient at times. So by building rapport, you earn the texter's trust so that they feel comfortable in sharing the full extent of their crisis. Using warm and empathic tones is an effective way to build that trust. So I want you to imagine maybe a person texts in and says that they're having suicidal ideation because they're being bullied at school. So to build trust with them, instead of just, immediately saying, okay, we're going to send the police out if you're feeling suicidal, or, what's your address right away? You may say, it sounds like you're feeling isolated, or you're not alone, I'm here to listen. Can you tell me more about what's going on? Have you made any attempts to hurt yourself tonight? It changes the tone of the text, and it lets the texter know that there is a human person on the other line, and it's not as automated, it's not as black and white. We're here to help. So again, there are skills that can help you demonstrate genuineness and presence with texters in crisis. Of course, active listening, empathy, unconditional positive regard, open-ended questions. We want to avoid giving advice to come off because we don't want to come off as judgmental. And then we want to use these techniques to develop trust. And these are just some of the skills that we can utilize. So each texter who contacts us forms their first impression pretty quickly, especially if they're in crisis. So we all know how important first impressions are. And since our initial greeting follows an automated message, and then maybe in some instances, depending on your agency, a user-initiated canned message, you want to make sure that you sound human. So a lot of times when people text 911, they'll get an automated message that says, you've texted 911, please wait for the next available agent. And then that text will come into your center, you'll click on it, and there'll be options that you can text back. And maybe the first one that we'll send is, this is 911, what is the address of your emergency? And that person may or may not give you the address, but then the message that follows that should be something a little bit more human, more empathetic, so that we can start to build that rapport with the texters. So 62% of texters said that they've shared something via text that they've never shared with anyone before. And again, that's because texting is very intimate, it's private. Nobody can hear you when you're telling somebody about something traumatic that happened to you. It's just between you and the 911 operator that's on the other line taking that text. But again, it's important to be sure that we're being empathetic, that we're being compassionate through our texting, so that we don't lose that person, and that, they don't just stop texting us. So what are some rapport techniques that we can use? So reflection and paraphrasing. So reflection and paraphrasing refers to rewording statements to demonstrate that we understand the issue. So those techniques show that we're listening and that we're doing our best to try to be compassionate and put ourselves in their shoes. We can also use this technique when we want to double check that we're understanding the texter correctly. Now, the important thing is that we want to make sure that we don't parrot what the texter says. So we don't want to word for word just say everything that they're saying to us. So it's also important to use strong feeling words that capture the essence of what the texter is going through, because this helps the texter feel understood and heard. So an example would be the texter texts in, "I'm so alone, and the fight with my boyfriend about my drug use is really just pissing me off." So you could say, "So you already felt isolated, and today's fight just added fuel to the fire." And this kind of gives them the validation that you are listening and that you're there to help them, so that we can build that rapport and move forward to try to find out exactly what the issue today is or what they're texting about. And so these questions tell the texter that you understand them while avoiding the introduction of any opinion or advice. So again, they're more likely to allow us to send them emergency responders. So validation and tennifiers. So a texter may text in, "It's stupid for me to feel this way, I just want to die." We may want to use a tennifier. And a tennifier is a technique that we use for labeling feelings to make it tentative. So we use phrases like, "it sounds like," "it seems," "you think." The reason that we use this is to kind of put the texter back in control of the conversation, or we want to give that illusion at least. We never want to assume and say, "You're feeling sad," or "You're suicidal," but we want to give them the opportunity to kind of feel like they're in control, to encourage them and again build that rapport with them. So if someone texts in, "It's stupid for me to feel this way, I just want to die," we may say, "Well, from what you're saying about the fight, it's understandable to feel overwhelmed and upset." We want to validate them. And so we use validations to recognize and normalize the texter's feelings, to accept the texter's emotions and crisis without judgment, to thoughtfully show the texter that we hear them and that we support them, and to give them the space and permission to feel the way that they feel. We also avoid validations that imply that it's the texter's fault, imply that the texter deserves to go through with the crisis, imply that their feelings of hopelessness or worthlessness are justified, or imply that they should continue with mentally or physically harmful behavior. For example, if someone texts in and says, they reveal a sexual assault to you, we don't want to say, especially if they're feeling guilt and they say, "It's my fault. I was sexually assaulted by a family member. It's my fault." We don't want to say it's understandable to feel that way, because that leads the texter to believe that we're agreeing with them. A better validating message would be, sometimes people feel that way after an assault, but please know that it's absolutely not your fault and no one deserves to be assaulted. Again, we're building that rapport with them. We're letting them know that we hear them, we're validating them, and that we want to help them and get them the resources that they need. So open-ended versus close-ended questions. So longer messages are associated with more effective conversations. The average length for most effective messages is about 99 characters, and most messages are going to be limited to 160 characters due to the carrier's standard messaging standards. So we don't want to just ask yes or no questions, because they're not effective and they inhibit the texter from expanding on what they're thinking or what they're feeling. And they keep dispatchers from gathering the information that they need when we're trying to explore the problem or the reason that someone's calling in. So, and we also want to avoid why questions, because sometimes they can seem judgmental and accusatory over text. Again, because it's via text, texters aren't able to hear the intended tone. So a close-ended question example would be, "My boyfriend and I have been arguing today. I can't take it anymore." And if the dispatcher just messages back, "Did he hit you?" The texter's probably going to message back yes or no, right? And that's the end of that. A why question, "My boyfriend and I have been arguing today and I can't take it anymore. Why?" It kind of comes off a little judgmental. So the best example would be an open-ended question where it says, "My boyfriend and I have been arguing today and I can't take it anymore." So you would say something like, "It sounds like this is really upsetting you. Can you tell me more about what's going on today?" Again, we're empathizing with the caller or the texter, and we're letting them know that we're here to help. We want to know more about the situation. So just like sometimes with kids, when they do something good, we want to point out that they did something good. Similarly, in crisis situations, we want to point out the positive actions of the texter. People in crisis are always going to be focused on the negatives, so it's great to remind them of the positive things that they're doing. For example, it's brave of you to reach out for support. Strength IDs like this can guide the texter towards being more receptive for help while reflecting their inherent strengths back to them. And this can also alleviate the feelings of helplessness and hopelessness that sometimes they feel when they're in crisis. So if somebody says, my uncle has been raping me for 5 years, it's my fault, I suck. You don't just want to say, you don't suck, you're awesome, I can tell you're a really good person. This doesn't really speak to their strengths because you don't know this person. They just disclose something incredibly intimate and personal to you. We can't speak about their character, who they are. We don't really know that. So a better example would be, I'm impressed with your strength. Coming forward to report this today is very brave. You seem like a courageous person, right? Again, we're focusing on the facts, what they've told us. We want to kind of guide them towards the positives, which is that they reached out for help. And again, we want to build that rapport with them. So data shows that 3 words that show up in most successful conversations are brave, smart, and proud. So as long as you, at some point, sprinkle some of those words in, it kind of helps to point out the positive strengths of the texters when they're in crisis. So word choice. So strong feeling words help our texters feel heard and understood. Finding the appropriate vocabulary for paraphrasing a texter's crisis helps us capture the uniqueness of the crisis, validate the texter's feelings, and better understand what the texter is going through. While using strong words is important, it's also important to avoid minimizers such as little angry, kind of mad, and maximizers like really angry or very mad. And the reason we want to avoid those is, even though we use these often in everyday speech, minimizers have an effect of minimizing what the texter is going through, and they stand in the way of validating their feelings and making them feel heard. So we don't want to say, it sounds like you're kind of mad, or yeah, I get it, you're a little angry. Obviously they're angry, they're mad. We don't want to minimize any of those feelings. And maximizers just kind of encourage the imprecise naming of feelings. So when you say someone's really angry or very mad, it's just unnecessary wording. Again, if we have limited characters, we want to try to keep it to just what we need. We don't want anything too superfluous. And again, you may be saying, well, some of these techniques that you've been mentioning, they're very wordy. Well, it's important to pick our words to make sure that the texter feels heard, so that they're able to communicate with us and that we're able to get them the help that they need. So grammar and spelling, obviously proofreading is important. We want to strive to be as professional as we can, and we want to avoid grammatical errors. We always want to strive for clear, grammatically correct messages that are easy to read and easy to comprehend. We also want to try to avoid exclamation points, because for somebody on the other end, those exclamation points can come across as sarcastic or ambiguous over text. And so we don't want to damage the professional tone, or if we've been trying to build rapport, we don't want to damage that by using unnecessary exclamation points. The other thing we want to try to avoid is text speak, right? So how are you feeling? BRB, LOL, THX. We don't want to use text speak because it's too colloquial. Again, we want to try to remain professional. We want to try to make ourselves seem like we're reliable and we're competent, so that they trust us and we're able to get them the help that they need. So another part of empathy and building the rapport is having cultural awareness. So having cultural competence will help you be aware of how your views about differences affect your interactions with others. In order to get our biases out of the way, we need to identify them. And most times people from certain cultural groups will, readily identify themselves. So one of the big groups is, our deaf, hard of hearing. Deaf culture is heavily influenced by the use of sign language, like American Sign Language, British Sign Language, etc. So these are structurally and grammatically different from spoken languages. Many deaf people learn sign language as their first language, and some of them do not develop the spoken language fluency due to language deprivation. So oftentimes when they text in, they're still going to be short keying. They're texting that they know from their TDD, TTY. It's important for us to just kind of interpret it the best that we can, make our messages as simple as we can so that they understand them and they're not overwhelmed with our wording, so that we can get them the help that they need. So the LGBTQ plus community includes those who identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, questioning, or other identities on the sexuality and gender spectrum. These texters are typically seeking acknowledgement, respect, and support. Having an awareness of the common issues experienced by members of this community will go a long way in helping you be more effective in supporting them. So apart from working with the National Crisis Text Line since 2016, in 2019, I started working with the Trevor Project. And the Trevor Project specifically works with LGBTQ youth. That's our main demographic. And I remember I'd gotten a text one time from a young person, and they said, I'm feeling really frustrated. I've been self-harming. My parents don't understand me because I'm NB. And it was spelled ENBY. And I had no idea what that was. So I had to ask the texter to clarify. And I was like, I'm sorry, I'm not understanding. Would you mind explaining to me what NB is? And then they texted back the letters NB, Nora Boy. And so I was still kind of confused, but then I kind of realized the setting that I was in, and NB, non-binary. And so while I still maybe don't fully understand that concept, I know that that's what they were talking about, and I have an understanding of that so that I'm able to help them. Again, it's about communication. If you don't understand something, it's okay to clarify. A lot of times there's this perception that 911 call takers know everything and that we know how to handle every situation. Sometimes we don't, so sometimes we need to get that clarification from our texters. So another demographic that we may be dealing with is military personnel, veterans, and dependents who text in. So they come with their own unique sets of needs. Many veterans and military personnel experience guilt as a result of needing support or surviving when their battle buddies didn't. Depression and suicide are common in these texters as a response to trauma. Transitioning to civilian life or reintegration can be extremely difficult because it can trigger depression and isolation, which can lead to self-medicating, substance abuse, and suicidal ideation. So military dependents also may be texting in because they're undergoing a domestic violence situation. One of the issues, again, with military policing is that the military police has very strict regulations, right? So at any point, if you're found to be guilty of domestic violence, you could lose your housing, you could lose your job. So there's a lot more risk for military personnel than there is for civilians. And just some of the data that we've gathered from the crisis text line. So the percentage in conversation of texters that have mentioned their military affiliation has gone up. So for example, in 2014, 1.8% of all the conversations were military affiliated personnel. In 2015, that number jumped up to 2.0%. And then in 2016, it jumped up to 2.4%. So you may think that 1.8 to 2.4 doesn't seem like a lot, but that's an almost 33% increase in military affiliated personnel that were texting in when they were in crisis. And then our last group, of course, is law enforcement and first responders. So we know that they have their own culture, right? We're part of that culture. It's important to be respectful, and it's important to know that when somebody from law enforcement or a first responder texts in, it's because they really need help. And so we need to take the time to be empathetic, to get them the help that they know that they can get, and be respectful of their situation. So for building rapport, there's a formula that we like to use. So we've talked about tennifiers, right? That it seems like, it looks like, what I'm hearing is. We want to pair that with a strong feeling word so that they feel validated. Again, you're feeling paralyzed, you're feeling anxious, you're feeling terrified, you're feeling, whatever the situation may be, so that they recognize that we know what they're going through. And then the source of the feeling. So again, we want to kind of use that paraphrasing technique to paraphrase or summarize exactly what it was that they told us. So a critical part of being empathetic to a texter is warmth. So after a texter talks to you, they may not remember exactly what you said, but they'll always remember how you made them feel. So a texter may text in, "People always think I'm a girl, but that's not how I feel inside. It hurts to be called the wrong pronouns. I don't want to be around people. I don't want to live anymore. So a response from our end would be, it seems like this is a frustrating situation. You deserve to choose how people refer to you. Having your body not match how you feel can be paralyzing. Thank you for reaching out for help today. So again, we have our tenor. It seems like our strong feeling words, frustrating, paralyzing, and then the source of the feelings. People aren't referring to you the way that you choose. So after we start building rapport, it's important that we start to try to identify what the actual problem is, right? Sometimes, especially when people text in help or I have a problem or emergency, we need to try to get down to the root of what's actually going on. So why do they text in? Why do they need help? So the first thing that we need to do is identify the precipitating event. So crisis is often the precipitated event that's caused by a sudden or significant change. So there was a trigger. What led them to be triggered, and what is the underlying issue that needs to be addressed? And then as we dive deeper into the underlying problem, a texter will often identify a scenario that often involves various problems. So it's our job as dispatchers to help them figure out what the central problem is, right? What do you need from us? What do we need to do to help you? So for example, a texter may share that she's feeling anxious because her cousin is going to be staying in her home this weekend. So, obviously anyone can just go, well, can you not go stay somewhere else? Problem solved. But the central problem may be that the anxiety is caused by a history of sexual abuse. So if this central problem seems to be disconnected from the precipitating event, we need to try to get a full understanding by asking and encouraging them to elaborate. So tell me more, go ahead, exploring the emotions around the crisis, not just the facts. And then lastly, understanding the history. So how long has this been going on? And step 3, we always want to assess for risk in any situation, for officer safety and for texter safety. So it's important to note that not every texter poses a safety risk, but assessing for risk can happen at any stage during the conversation if the texter implies anything that should be explored by the dispatcher. So if they've threatened self-harm or if they've said that they've taken pills, we want to make sure that we know exactly what's going on so that we can get them the resources that they need. If they've been drinking, obviously we need to let the officers know. So what are some common texter events that people are going to be texting in about? So mental health, right? That's going to be one of our big ones. So mental health, despite the prevalence of mental illness and depression, a negative stigma still exists in society today. So texters who are suffering may feel embarrassed or guarded about sharing their experiences. If a texter discloses that they have depression or any other mental illness, we want to validate those feelings and then focus on the reason that they texted in today. So we want to demonstrate that you're comfortable with the issues, that you empathize, and that you remind yourself that the texter is not the disorder, but the person that's living with the disorder. Suicide. So according to research, as many as 75 people who die by suicide say something or do something that indicate that their state of mind and intentions is on suicidal ideation before they act. So it's not that they want the attention, it's that they need the attention and the intervention. It's important to note that when we're talking about suicide, we want to avoid phrases like commit suicide or suicide attempt, because these perpetuate the stigma around suicide, dating back to when suicide was illegal or maybe considered sinful or a taboo subject. We need to stress that people that die by suicide are not criminals. They're people that are in need and they're dealing with an illness. So we want to stick to terminology like died by suicide, completed suicide. And both of those seem pretty direct, but they come without any added stigma so that we can help the caller kind of realize, or the texter realize, the gravity of the situation and let them know that we want to help them. Self-harm. So any means of deliberately causing injury to one's own body without the intent to die. In general, self-harm is a coping mechanism for dealing with several severe emotional distress. Self-harm can translate into emotional pain, into physical pain, and often the texter finds that physical pain is easier to cope with. So you may be in a situation where maybe somebody's saying that they're harming while they're texting you. So it's important that we try to get them to stop. And sometimes they'll listen to us and sometimes they won't. But as we're talking to them and building rapport, our texter is always going to be our priority. So even though it's rare, there may be situations where someone who's engaging in self-harm will hurt themselves more severely than they planned. So again, by building rapport and making them feel safe, we want them to disclose to us if maybe they need medical attention. So for example, they may share that they're bleeding a lot or that they're feeling faint. These are situations, these are things that we need to know so that we can get them the proper care and the proper response. So overdoses, against substance abuse. Texters who are dealing with substance abuse have likely been the victim of shame and stigma. So it's important not to be judgmental, to be empathetic to all the texters' emotions and all their statements. Sexual abuse and violence. Any sexual action that's committed against someone without their consent. It's important to stress that you believe the texter and express empathy for what happened, because unfortunately most people encounter that after they're sexually assaulted, people will question them. So maybe something that we want to say to those texters is, you're incredibly strong for speaking up about this. I believe you, and it can be terrifying to share such an awful experience. Or it's normal to feel that this is your fault, but no one deserves to be assaulted no matter what they have done. In case somebody says it's my fault, or they try to, blame themselves, or they have that guilt regarding their sexual assault. With domestic violence, a pattern of abusive behaviors, including physical, sexual, psychological. It can manifest as coercive behaviors, such as economic coercion. So what's important to know about domestic violence is, individuals that are in this situation may not be ready to leave their abuser. Many factors contribute to why people stay. So as a dispatcher, it's most effective to try and provide understanding, validation, resources, rather than suggesting that they leave their partner or giving them advice. Our goal is to always get people the resources that they need. And if someone is texting regarding domestic violence, 9 out of 10 times they want to report it. But they may be scared, and so that may be a reason why they're texting in. It's also important to note that with texting, again, we don't have the context clues of what's going on in the background, right? We can't hear what's going on. So this, with anything like substance abuse, self-harm, domestic violence, it's important that we use our risk assessment and try to figure out, are there any weapons? Is that person still there? Again, in order for someone to give us that information, though, we need to build that rapport. And child abuse. So the physical or sexual mistreatment of a child under the age of 18, also including incest and neglect, that may be something that, is kind of very personal, that people don't really want to share, keep to themselves. And it may be years before someone comes forward to share that with you. So when they do, it's important that we give them the respect and the empathy that they deserve so that they don't feel discouraged from reporting their assaults. And then common texter troubleshooting or issues that we've seen. So circling. Circling happens when a texter wants an ongoing relationship with the dispatcher because they've received great service in the past. So we don't want to fall into the trap of thinking that providing better support by staying engaged with the texter is what we need to do. Sometimes we need to let them go. We need to refer them to officers or paramedics or crisis intervention. And although it may take a while to get the information for the call for service, again, the goal is always going to be to build rapport, identify the problems, gather the pertinent information, and get responders to them. Sending resources to texters provide a more permanent solution, so they're not more likely to just keep texting you and just needing someone to talk to or vent to. So all texters will not want to have a conversation, right? So we may get some texters that are very hesitant, that don't want to give you their address, they don't want to give you their name, they don't really want to go into detail, they may feel ashamed or embarrassed. But the thing is that they reached out at some point because they do want to report it, they do want to talk to someone. So we just need to make sure that, again, we're trying our best to build that rapport and get the information that we need so that we can get them the help that they need. Texters may opt out of conversations. So many times, similar to phone conversations, people may get second thoughts about calling for help, and they may want to disregard. So it's important to try to identify the problem and gather as much information to determine if the nature of the text is something that can be disregarded in accordance to your agency's policies. So I remember it was about a year ago, we kept getting these 911 hang-up calls, and it was the same texter or the same caller. And our policy at our agency was you get a 911 hang-up, you call it back, they don't answer, or it doesn't sound like there's a disturbance, you just kind of log the call and you move on to the next call. And so this person kept calling and calling and calling, but they never said anything and they hung up. Eventually, they got to the point where they did speak to one of my coworkers, and they were able to share that they were a victim of sexual assault. And it was a young 16-year-old girl. And I guess every time she called and she heard 911, what's your emergency? She kind of felt startled, she kind of felt scared. And so she had to hang up and then try again until she kind of finally built up the courage to try to tell people what was going on. And so I think it would be incredibly discouraging if this little girl finally did get the resilience to try to, come forward and report this, and she gets less than stellar service or get somebody that doesn't seem very compassionate. She's going to shut down, and the likelihood that she's going to report again, it's going to be a while before she gathers up that strength to be able to do that. And texters that disappear. So some texters simply will stop responding to you. It could be because they've gotten everything that they need from your conversation, or they were interrupted by something or someone else. So again, in those situations where you're texting from a bathroom stall, or you're texting from the privacy of your car, and then somebody comes up to you, you may have to stop that texting because you just, you don't want to share that with anyone else. Or it could be because maybe if you're in a domestic violence situation, your partner's nearby and you don't want them to know that you've reached out for help. So it's important to note that maybe they've stopped responding for safety reasons. In those situations, it's important to refer to your agency's policies to determine if you should attempt to re-engage with the texter based on the specific situation or the issue that was reported. So are there any questions, anything about texting or anything that you would like me to clarify on for empathy or responses to texters? Just make sure to put those in the chat. What I'm going to go ahead and share is a handout. So we talked about the upload, or the file didn't upload. But if you're interested, just email me. I have a cheat sheet for those strong feeling words that we can use. So it's a great resource because not only can you use it for texting, but you can use it in emails to try to get your point across. So let me know. I'm going to go ahead and share 2 other handouts that are from the Denise Amber Lee Foundation and talk a little bit more about our foundation, our third-party quality assurance, as well as some of the courses and trainings that we offer. I'm also going to go ahead and put in the link for next month's webinar. So next month we have Julie Giuliani, who's going to be speaking to us. Julie is an award-winning best author. She has for 20 years spoken about development in the workplace and about retention. So it's going to be a great webinar. If you'd like to join us, I'll put that in the chat as well. Again, the link to the webinar will be sent out probably later today along with the certificate. And again, if any of you have any questions, I'll go ahead and put my email down in the chat. Feel free to email me with any questions, or if you have anything that you think would be useful for future presentations, let me know. All right, guys, thank you so much for joining us today. I hope you guys have a great day.